So as we continue to have people join, I just wanted to say welcome to everybody today. We're really glad that you took some time out of your busy schedules to join us while we talk about some exciting bird conservation as a result of the election. So I would like to introduce myself. I'm Jennifer Cipolletti, Director of Conservation Advocacy for American Bird Conservancy. Again, thank you all so much for joining today's webinar. We really look forward to this discussion. We will have three presenters today, Steve Holmer, Joel Merriman, and myself. If you have questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A section. Our speakers will be happy to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Our first speaker today will be Steve Holmer, Vice President of Policy for American Bird Conservancy. He will provide an overview of what the election means for birds and cover topics including regulatory actions on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act going forward, the Biden transition team, reinstating and expanding no lead shot regulations, sage grouse, and the Endangered Species Act. Then I will present on conservation funding and glass collisions legislation. And lastly, we will turn it over to Joel Merriman, ABC's Director of Bird Smart Wind Energy, to discuss relevant policy items. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Steve to get us started today. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're excited to hear your updates.
Great, thanks very much, Jennifer. And thank you all for joining us. So the election of President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris is good news for birds. We've heard quite a few very positive statements from the Biden-Harris campaign in support of addressing climate change and promoting renewable energy development, dealing with social justice issues, particularly in connection with the tribes, and also advancing support for land and water protection in the Americas. So all very positive. And so understanding that the transition team is already hard at work, and we look forward to working with them to advance bird conservation. So in Congress, the situation is a little less clear. In the House, there is a narrowed Democratic majority. It appears that Republicans have picked up 8 or 9 seats there. But Nancy Pelosi has been reelected as Speaker and will be leading bird conservation efforts from the House. And in the Senate, things are very unclear. There are 2 seats in Georgia still undecided, and that will be determined on an election January the 5th. The current status is the balance is 50 to 48, Republican majority. But if the Democrats were to pick up those 2 seats, Kamala Harris would become the tiebreaker, and there would be a Democratic majority. But in any case, given the narrow margins in both the House and the Senate, this is going to really put a premium on bipartisanship and the need to have bird conservation champions from both parties. So in terms of the specific issues that we're hoping to see the next administration and Congress address, it's important to look at the backdrop, which is that we've seen a significant loss in birds, 3 billion bird loss over the last 50 years. So, it's just not where we would like things to be. And so some change is needed. And we've been closely analyzing that. And part of the solution is to defend the existing protections for birds. We also know that from our reviews that existing conservation programs are effective, but that they need to be significantly scaled up, that we need to increase the capacity for bird conservation and simply do more of the things that we know are effective. A key regulatory area that we need to do some work on is about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. The current administration issued a legal opinion, the M opinion, that ended the existing enforcement of the law against incidental take, which is that the foreseeable and predictable killing of birds from industrial sources. And there was also a number of directives issued that ended the existing enforcement. This was challenged by conservation groups, including American Bird Conservancy and a coalition of 8 states. And that legal challenge was successful, and the administration's M opinion was struck down, but that decision has now been appealed. And at the same time, there has been a proposed rulemaking that would do much the same, that would end this enforcement of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act And that rule is now under White House review, and we expect that it will be released before the end of this administration. And so that's obviously something that we're going to continue to oppose and try to reaffirm the protection of the law against incidental take. There has been legislation introduced that we believe would help address this issue. It's the Migratory Bird Protection Act, introduced by Representative Alan Lowenthal. It's HR 5552. The bill's passed a House committee, and what it would do, in addition to reaffirming protection against incidental take, is it would move things forward by establishing a permitting system for incidental take. We already have quite a few available best management practices that can protect birds from industrial sources like oil and gas drilling and power lines and towers and wind farms. And so we would like to see that these best management practices become the basis for a general permit. And the law would essentially allow for the creation of these permits. And we believe that this is a very workable solution based on the available practices that we have now. Another critical area that we need to ramp up our activity in is around the Endangered Species Act. There have been a number of new regulations concerning listing, the amount of take protection listed species receive, the amount of critical habitat protection species will receive. And when you add all these things up, it amounts to a significant erosion of the available protections for endangered species. And so we believe that all of these regulations need to be reversed. And at the same time, we need to get back to implementing the law as it should be, which is basing decisions on best science. We feel like things have gotten very politicized, and that's been to the detriment of good decision making and the species and the habitat resource. And we do also see another important path forward, which is to increase recovery funding. In 2016, we did an analysis that looked at every US listed bird population. And what we found in general was that they were doing well. Most of them had increasing populations. A significant number had already been delisted. Quite a few more were stable. We did, however, find that there are some that are still in decline, that more work needs to be done, particularly in Hawaii. And so we're trying to target our efforts to boost recovery in these places where we need to do greater activity. But it does show that the law is working and has been very effective at protecting and recovering birds. Another key challenge deals with the sage grouse. This is a wide-ranging species that lives across a good part of the Great Basin, and it's seen a significant population decline, at least 90%, a major range contraction. About half of its historic range is now no longer supporting grouse. It's been on a long downward population trend, and at the same time, we're seeing the habitat see significant degradation and fragmentation. And so there's just less resource, less habitat available for the grouse. And right now, its endangered species status is that it's actually precluded from listing. It really doesn't matter how bad the situation gets for the grouse, it's simply not eligible. And that's a serious problem. We think that we need to remove that ESA exemption that's been basically added to the annual appropriations bill each year. So we're really hoping that this is the year that rider comes out. And at the same time, the regulatory mechanisms that are part of an ESA listing decision have also become very inadequate. Just today, the Bureau of Land Management announced new grouse conservation plans that amount to a significant step backwards in terms of protection for the grouse and protection for the habitat. And so when we look at the whole range of regulatory mechanisms that are in place for the grouse right now, they're woefully inadequate and will not conserve the species or provide a sufficient amount of sagebrush habitat. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done to conserve the sage grouse. So another critical area of regulatory strengthening needs to happen around the National Environmental Policy Act. There have been a number of changes. Just yesterday, the Forest Service issued a new National Environmental Policy Act rule that can be lumped into two categories: limiting science and analysis and limiting public participation. We don't think either of those are a good idea. We're very concerned about the Council on Environmental Quality rule change, which allows agencies to ignore cumulative impacts. Well, this is very important for species like the spotted owl that have been impacted by past cumulative impacts. So another key area is in limiting public participation or categorical exclusions. And these are projects that can happen with very little or no public participation. And in some cases, harmful activities are being allowed as categorical exclusions. So that's of great concern. And then another challenge area has to do with pesticides. We believe that the Environmental Protection Agency needs to be revitalized and reformed to start taking a harder look at pesticides. We know that there are still chemicals on the market that have human health impacts and that are harmful to birds and other wildlife. And so banning the most harmful pesticides, such as chlorpyrifos, are a clear first step. Another class of pesticides, the neonicotinoids, also need to have a much harder look. We did a study a number of years ago that found that if a bird eats as little as a single coated seed with these chemicals on it, it's enough to kill the bird. And so at the very least, ending the preemptive use and the seed coatings of these neonic chemicals might be a good first step. But at the core is that we need the Environmental Protection Agency to take a harder look and really address the problems with these chemicals, and also consider the social justice aspect, which is that farm workers are suffering from pesticide poisoning, as are the local communities where these toxic chemicals are being produced. So looking ahead to 2021, we're really excited that we have an administration that is committed to trying to tackle conservation issues. And we very much look forward to working with the agencies and the Biden team to solve these problems. Looking ahead, we're right now developing a migratory bird rescue package with Audubon and a number of our other partners. We'll probably be unveiling all the details of that in an upcoming presentation very soon. So I really appreciate you all joining us. We're hoping to see great progress on wildlife and habitat mitigation. We would love to see President Obama's mitigation memorandum be put back into effect and all those agency processes resumed, and get the policy wheels turning again to advance conservation. And of course, conservation planning for species like the sage grouse, and for addressing climate change, carbon storage in forests and grasslands. The Northwest Forest Plan is one of our most significant climate change success stories, because it has turned an entire region from being a source of carbon emissions to being a sink because of these forests growing, being allowed to regrow and store all that carbon. So we need to be building on those successes. And I'll now turn it over to Jennifer Cipolletti to talk about some of the things that are pending right now.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that update. That was excellent. I know that we're trying to pack a lot into this presentation, but we're just really excited that everybody could join us. What I'll be talking about is briefly about high-level appropriations efforts, including successes and ongoing advocacy. And one thing to note as I do present on this is that we are a nonpartisan organization. And we work really hard with both sides of the aisle to make sure that we can do great partner work with our other organizations to accomplish these important conservation actions. And after I talk about those appropriations efforts, I will then cover our bipartisan federal glass collisions legislation. Slide, please. So we had some really amazing advances in the 116th Congress. Last year, Congress did reverse a decades-old trend of budget cuts with a $10 million increase for key bird conservation programs. Most of these increases went to the migratory bird joint ventures and state and tribal wildlife grants, which was really exciting because those are definitely programs that needed an increase in funds. And this year, the House also passed an additional $15 million increase beyond that $10 million. So that is an incredibly exciting thing that has happened that we're really hoping to continue into the next Congress. Another item that was of incredible note was that the Bird Safe Buildings Act passed the House not once, but twice. And we are really hoping that a larger relief bill will be able to carry that bill on through the next Congress. And I'll talk about that one a little bit later. And these successes all happened through coordinated outreach efforts. A large coalition of more than 150 conservation groups asked for increases for these different programs. So looking at FY 2021 proposed increases, to meet the needs of these conservation programs, we really need to continue to advocate for these increased funding. The migratory bird joint ventures, regional partnerships are managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And these are really integral conservation programs that have priorities and they carry out projects to reverse population declines of at-risk species. So we were really grateful to have that $1.5 million increase. And other key migratory programs, like we mentioned earlier, were state and tribal wildlife grants that also received an increase. And the bill also maintained funding for the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act. So that retained $1 million increase. And that's of note because it does have a matching grant program that funds projects that conserve birds that breed and migrate through the United States and Canada. And then the State of the Birds activities really are working to arrest the bird extinction crisis in Hawaii. And we know that these are underfunded programs. So the work that we're doing with coordinated efforts with individuals and partners like all of you that have joined us today are incredibly important to these conservation victories. And without funding, these essential programs can't continue in their current capacity to protect birds and their habitats. Slide, please. So your voices are making this progress possible. Like we mentioned before, people's involvement has led to a $10 million increase in the FY 2020 budget. A $15 million increase has been proposed in the House. We currently have over 175 groups endorsing the funding package. This effort will continue through 2020, and we need your help to ask Congress to support increased funding for conservation programs that benefit threatened wildlife and public lands. And you can advocate by signing this action alert to request funding for the FY 2021 appropriations and spread the word asking for support. Slide, please. So the Bird Safe Buildings Act, this is a bill that we have been working on for the better part of 10 years before I even was with American Bird Conservancy. And so the fact that it has passed the House twice this year is an absolutely incredible victory for bird conservation. It was previously introduced by Representatives Mike Quigley and Morgan Griffith. We know that up to 1 billion birds die every year in the US alone. It's a pretty tremendous number. And so this bipartisan bill has amazing support on both sides of the aisle, and it's designed to reduce bird mortality by calling for federal buildings to incorporate bird-safe building materials, design features, and lighting. So it did pass again twice this year as part of larger packages, first in July as an amendment to the Invest in America's Act, also called the Moving Forward Act, and then also in September as an amendment to a larger infrastructure package, the Clean Jobs and Innovation Act. We are awaiting introduction in the Senate. We're currently looking for a Republican co-sponsor. We had a really active and successful campaign this fall to really encourage some of our Republican senators to join this bill. And also the House Appropriations bill directs agencies of the Department of Interior to take actions to reduce window collisions with their office buildings, nature and visitor centers. And this also includes assessing retrofits and in turning off lights. So we want the federal government to be a leader in bird safe buildings and to incorporate these bird friendly building design elements. Slide, please. So we know that the Bird Safe Buildings Act will reduce collisions by requiring these public buildings to incorporate bird friendly building design and materials. But the cool thing is it also can save energy. And because we have a House passed bill, we feel that it can be included in a must pass bill. We need the Senate to add this bill at the end of this, before the end of this Congress, to make sure that we can get this passed. So we are currently working with Senator Booker's office to see if we can get it attached to a larger bill because there was such tremendous support for it. So action that we would love for you all to take is to individuals and groups can sign this action alert asking your members of Congress to co-sponsor and support the Bird Safe Buildings Act. You can also check out this link to see how you can make your windows bird friendly at home or if you are still going into your office. And it's a really exciting bill that we've been working on, and we're hoping to see some progress continue as the year goes on. And then with that, I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Joel Merriman, ABC's Director of BirdSmart Wind Energy. Joel, what would you like to share with us today?
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to have the opportunity to address everybody today. As Jennifer mentioned, I am the director of the BirdSmart Wind Energy campaign at American Bird Conservancy, and I'd like to talk a little bit about our program, provide a little bit of context about wind energy development in the U.S. and some applicable policy issues, and also where we anticipate the policy discussion to go from here. Next slide, please. So we need renewable energy to combat climate change. I'm sure that I don't have to tell this audience the far-ranging and very extreme impacts that we are anticipating from climate change. And renewable energy development is part of what needs to be a broad and multifaceted approach to combating this issue. The unfortunate reality is that renewable energy development and operation has had and is continuing to have unforeseen impacts to the environment more broadly, but also specifically to birds. And this is true of all the forms of renewable energy, including both solar and wind. But we certainly have a lot more data about wind and have a good understanding of that. Next slide, please. So drilling down into the impact specifically of wind energy, we know that more than 500,000 birds are killed by wind turbines every year. And that's already a very big number. But again, this is something that is anticipated to continue to grow as this development proliferates across the country. And one projection put it at 1.4 million birds are anticipated to be killed on an annual basis by the year 2030. So that is just looking at the direct mortality associated from collisions with the turbines themselves. But there is additional mortality associated with collisions with power lines. Power lines in and of themselves are a source of mortality, not just by collisions with the power lines themselves, but also from electrocution. So there's more than one way that that happens. And there are power lines that do have to be developed to connect new wind energy facilities in some instances to the existing power grid. So that is an impact that needs to be considered and factored in when thinking about the broader impacts of wind energy development to birds. And so that all is how the mortality is considered and quantified. But you also have to consider that there can be displacement effects for certain species, where essentially the development and operation of a wind energy facility causes previously occupied and desirable habitat for a species to no longer be usable and essentially pushes them out of those areas. So that really kind of encompasses, at least for terrestrial environment, the suite of impacts to birds. Next slide, please. And so in considering where this development is happening and thinking about how that is impacting birds of different species in different regions, this map is from the US Wind Turbine Database, which is operated by the US Geological Survey and other organizations. But if you look at the background map here, the green areas are where the wind turbines are currently on the landscape. And you can see that there are some pockets here and there. There's a little bit in Washington State, particularly along the Columbia River Gorge, certainly in parts of California. But you'll see there's a lot of it in the Great Plains. As you move down the center of the map, this is really Wind Alley, where you've got a combination of open and in many cases relatively flat landscapes and a lot of wind energy resource. So there's a lot there, and of course then kind of peppered throughout the upper Midwest and into New England. But at this point, we have more than 65,000 turbines operating in 43 states. There's also 2 offshore wind facilities. There's a 5-turbine facility operating off the coast of Block Island in Rhode Island, which was the first offshore wind energy facility. And then just earlier this year, 2 turbines were put in off the coast of Virginia by Dominion Energy. Next slide, please. But that's all just what's current. So in considering what we're anticipating moving farther down the pipeline, this is a projection by the Department of Energy that's looking at the projected wind capacity in 2050, and it puts it at 404 gigawatts across 48 states. And that's just a big number, doesn't mean a whole lot to a whole lot of people, but the point being, the map shows you in relative terms where this is anticipated to go. And you can see that there's still a lot in Wind Alley in those states in the Great Plains, and a lot on the coast as well. But one thing that I'll direct everyone's attention to is the blue portion of those pie charts. That is where there is anticipated to be offshore wind development and in what amounts for these different areas. And one in particular that I'll direct people's attention to is in the vicinity of the Great Lakes, where there is anticipated to be a reasonably considerable amount of wind energy development in the lakes themselves. Next slide, please. And then looking at the marine environment, this is what is currently being considered for offshore wind development in the oceans. You can see that there are a lot being considered currently, particularly in the Northeast, but there are some down in Virginia and in the Carolinas. And if you look to the left-hand side here, this is farther down the road, but there are places in California and Hawaii as well. But the interesting thing is here, we went from 5 turbines in the water at Block Island to a pipeline of 25 gigawatts. So this is happening very quickly. And I will note that we are anticipating a decision on the first commercial scale facility, which would be off the coast of Massachusetts, which would actually be we're expecting the record of decision on the 15th of January. So for those who are watching this project very closely, the proximity of the record of decision to the inauguration day is very interesting. So next slide, please. So talking a little bit about the BirdSmart Wind Energy Program, just looking at our overarching objectives, we do focus on some priority regions. The Northeast Atlantic region that I was just talking about in terms of the offshore development is one area that we're paying a lot of attention. Also the Great Lakes, since that is currently a frontier area for wind energy development. We do also get involved at the specific project level if it's one that's going to have outsized impacts or is otherwise precedent setting, but we do get involved at the project level as needed. We do also anticipate that there will be an incidental take permit issued for California condors. That discussion is just getting underway currently. So we get involved in these kinds of things. We also do want to engage and inform the public. There are a lot of takes on this issue, but we certainly like to ensure that we're getting our voice in there and making sure that there are balanced approaches as this development continues. And of course, policy. And this happens both at the federal level, where I'm working with Steve and Jennifer, but also at the state level when there are things going on. And so at the end of the day, ABC has been promoting best practices for wind energy development to minimize its impacts to birds for more than a decade at this point. Next slide, please. And part of how we do this is through our BirdSmart Wind Energy Principles. And I'm not going to go through all of these for today's webinar, but if you'll go one more slide. But I do want to touch on a couple that are of particular importance. And the first being that you have to site turbines in low risk areas. The siting of wind energy facilities really is of paramount importance. If you can keep turbines and facilities out of high risk areas, you're really going to minimize the impacts ultimately. And there's a variety of ways that you assess risk. You're looking at which species are there, you're looking at in what quantities, but at the end of the day, the siting is a really important facet of making sure that you're minimizing impacts. And then moving on to mitigation, the other end of the mitigation hierarchy, the compensatory mitigation, actually making sure that the birds that are being lost are then also being replaced is definitely of paramount importance and something that we really stress in our conversations with lawmakers and other decision makers. Next slide, please. So moving on to the policy side of things, there are a number of laws that are applicable to wind energy development, and Steve and Jennifer both have touched on many of these. The ones highlighted in red are the ones that Steve talked about that have been undermined by the current administration, have been weakened in one way, shape, or form. As yet, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act has not been weakened, but moving to the next slide, we do expect an update of the Eagle Rule in August of next year. And so the Eagle Rule is essentially how the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act is implemented in terms of the permitting and review process. This was last updated in 2016. There were a large number of changes that were made, some for the better, some for the worse. It included things like allowing for the first time take of the less abundant eastern population of golden eagle. But we do anticipate an update and we'll certainly be weighing in on what we think that needs to look like. And one of the issues is that despite the fact that the 2016 process was intended to make it easier to comply with the act and the rule, that few projects are obtaining permits even still. So we want to move to a process where permitting is mandatory and to the extent possible, make that as painless as possible while still being effective. Next slide, please. So there are other best management practices, certainly for wind energy development. The most important of these arguably is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service land-based wind energy guidelines. These were published in 2012. These were collaboratively developed by state and federal agencies, academic institutions, and the industry. And these do provide a very good blueprint for how to reduce the risk and impacts of wind energy facility development. Next slide, please. And we've had these for 8 years now, and there was a bit of interesting data that came out late last year. The Energy and Wildlife Policy Committee of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies did a survey of state fish and wildlife biologists that are involved in wind energy siting issues. And among many, many, many other things, the question was asked of these people, how effective do you think the federal wind energy guidelines are at supporting low impact wind siting, which is really a big part of the point. And a small number said very effective, 50% said somewhat effective, but then about a third said not very effective or not at all effective. So this could have been worse, certainly, but it doesn't give a lot of confidence that this is really accomplishing what it needs to be accomplishing. And it's very important to note that these were made voluntary. This was all developed and the rules issued under the Obama administration. So this is something that there's a lot of discussion about currently and will need to be revisited certainly in the coming years. Next slide, please. And so in looking at some current issues, this is looking at HR 4447, the Clean Economy, Jobs and Innovation Act, which passed the House in September of this year. This was really a packaging of a lot of bills that were being considered separately. And this, again, was a bit of a mixed bag. There were some very good things in there. I mentioned earlier that combating climate change needs to be a really multifaceted approach. There were some good things in there for energy efficiency, for distributed solar energy development, and some good language for wind and solar energy impact research and development, really trying to figure out and get a better handle on what these impacts are. But then there were some things in there that we find concerning. For example, there was a section that really is looking at more rapid and broad scale deployment of renewable energy on public lands. And that does have to be a balance, but we had concerns about really stressing that and pushing for that. There's a lot about energy grid expansion, which is needed for additional renewable energy development, but there are some impacts there as well that weren't really taken into account. And there was very little focus on the preservation or restoration of forests for carbon sequestration. So again, a little bit of a mixed bag. So next slide, please. And so really looking forward at this point, we know that the Biden administration is very focused on climate. A lot of the early speculation about appointments, it seems like there's a lot of very climate focused people who are likely to be playing important roles in the administration. So we certainly anticipate an increase in the amount of wind and other renewable energy development under the incoming administration. And at every step of the process, we're going to be advocating for a balanced approach, just making sure that the benefits that we're getting from this exceed the impacts. And just at the very end, I'll put in a plug again, getting back to the multifaceted approach to combating climate change. It's very important that we don't think that we can build our way out of this, but that we really take a big picture approach and really work on things like energy efficiency and distributed solar development to really come at this from all angles to make sure that we're ultimately minimizing the impacts to birds.